I rewrote my will the same week my daughter-in-law called me a burden, and I did it with a steady hand and a quiet smile that no one at that dinner table bothered to question. I didn't argue when Claire said it, her voice light, almost casual, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of the woman who had spent decades building the very life she now enjoyed. I didn't look at Michael either, not when he shifted in his seat and stared down at his plate like a man who had already chosen silence over truth. I simply folded my napkin, placed it beside my untouched dinner, and let the moment pass as though it hadn't carved something permanent into me. What I did instead, they never saw coming. The dining room looked exactly the way it always had, warm lighting casting a soft glow over the polished oak table, the same table I had saved for years to buy, the same one where birthday cakes had been cut and holidays had been celebrated. The house smelled faintly of rosemary and roasted chicken, a recipe I had perfected back when Michael was still a boy who would hug me without hesitation. But that night, everything felt different. The warmth was artificial. The laughter forced. Claire sat across from me, her posture flawless, her blonde hair falling neatly over her shoulders, every inch of her composed and in control. She had a way of speaking that made everything sound reasonable, even when it wasn't. "It's just a lot for someone your age to manage," she had said earlier, swirling her wine gently, her eyes not quite meeting mine. "This house, the maintenance, it's overwhelming." I nodded as if I agreed, though I knew exactly what she meant. It wasn't concern. It was calculation. Michael cleared his throat then, offering a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We've been thinking," he added, his voice careful, rehearsed. "Maybe it would be easier if you considered downsizing. Somewhere more manageable." Downsizing. Such a gentle word for being moved out of your own life. I took a sip of water, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable, though either of them seemed willing to sit with it for long. Claire leaned forward slightly, her tone softening in a way that might have sounded kind to anyone who didn't know better. "We just want what's best for you," she said. And there it was. The performance. The carefully chosen words. The illusion of care wrapped around something much colder. I looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time, I saw her clearly. Not as the woman my son had married, not as the person I had welcomed into this family, but as someone who had already decided where I belonged, and it wasn't here. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with something quieter. Something steadier. I set my glass down and offered a small smile, the kind that revealed nothing. "Of course," I said simply. "You're probably right." Claire relaxed at that, just slightly, as if she had been waiting for me to agree all along. Michael exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders in a way that told me everything I needed to know. They thought the conversation was over. They thought I had accepted it. But what they didn't understand was that acceptance and awareness are not the same thing. Later that night, after they had gone to bed and the house fell into that deep, echoing quiet that only comes when you realize you are no longer truly part of it, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second marking the shift I could feel settling inside me. I thought about the years I had spent making this place a home, about the sacrifices that had never been questioned because they had always been given freely. I thought about the way Claire's words had landed, not sharp, not loud, but precise. Deliberate. And I understood then that this hadn't started tonight. It had been building, piece by piece, in the small moments I had dismissed, the subtle changes I had chosen not to see. I stood slowly, my knees reminding me of my age in a way they hadn't before, and walked to the hallway where the family photos lined the wall. Michael as a child, grinning with missing teeth. Holidays where we stood close together, arms linked, believing in something that felt unbreakable at the time. I traced one of the frames lightly, my reflection faint in the glass. "A burden," I repeated under my breath, testing the word, letting it settle. It didn't hurt the way it should have. Not anymore. Because in that moment, something inside me shifted into place with quiet certainty. I turned off the lights, leaving the house in darkness, and made my way upstairs. Tomorrow, I would make a phone call. A simple one. Routine, even. But it would change everything. And they would never know until it was far too late. The next morning arrived with a kind of stillness that felt unfamiliar, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully risen, and lay in bed for a moment listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a car passing down the street. For years, my mornings had followed a rhythm I never questioned, coffee brewing in the kitchen, the soft shuffle of movement as life began again. But that morning, there was something different beneath the routine, something sharper, more deliberate. I got out of bed slowly, careful with each step, not because I needed to be quiet, but because I wanted to feel every moment clearly, without distraction. In the kitchen, the light from the window cast long shadows across the counter, illuminating the familiar objects that had once made me feel anchored. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the warmth of the mug steady in my hands, and sat at the same seat I had occupied for decades. From there, I could see the backyard, the garden I had planted years ago, now meticulously maintained but no longer truly mine. I took a sip and let my thoughts settle, not rushing them, not forcing anything. The clarity came on its own. Claire's words from the night before did not echo loudly anymore, they did not sting or demand a reaction. Instead, they sat quietly in the back of my mind, like a fact that had already been accepted. A burden. The word had lost its power the moment I understood why she had used it. It was never about concern. It was never about my well-being. It was about positioning, about control, about making me smaller so that her place could feel larger. I heard footsteps on the stairs then, light and measured, followed by the soft click of heels against hardwood. Claire entered the kitchen with the same effortless composure she always carried, dressed neatly as if the day ahead required presentation more than presence. She glanced at me briefly, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "You are up early," she said, moving toward the counter. I nodded, keeping my expression calm. "I could not sleep," I replied. She hummed softly in acknowledgement, already reaching for a glass, pouring herself water with the quiet confidence of someone who felt entirely at home. And she was at home. That was the difference. This had once been my space, shaped by my choices, my routines, my memories. Now, it belonged to something else. To someone else. Michael appeared a few minutes later, his tie already in place, his phone in his hand as he scrolled through emails with practiced indifference. "Morning, Mom," he said, not looking up. I watched him for a moment, taking in the familiar lines of his face, the small habits that had not changed since he was young, and I felt something shift again, not into sadness, but into understanding. He had made his choice long before last night. He had simply waited for the right moment to let it become visible. "Good morning," I answered evenly. Claire set a plate in front of him, something simple, something efficient. They moved around each other with ease, a quiet coordination that spoke of shared plans, shared intentions. I finished my coffee without another word, placing the mug gently in the sink before turning toward the hallway. "I have a few errands to run today," I said, my tone casual, unremarkable. Claire glanced at me again, her expression neutral but attentive. "Do you need anything?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, thank you." Michael barely acknowledged it, already absorbed in whatever was on his screen. That was how it worked now. My movements, my plans, my presence had become peripheral, something noted but not considered. And for the first time, I saw the advantage in that. The drive across town felt different than it usually did, not because the roads had changed, but because I had. The same shops. The same intersections, the same quiet suburban streets passed by my window, but I was not thinking about groceries or appointments, or the small tasks that had once filled my days. I was thinking about structure. About ownership. About the quiet power of decisions made without announcement. When I pulled into the parking lot, the building looked exactly as it always had, unassuming, almost forgettable, the kind of place people entered without considering how much could change once they stepped inside. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, feeling a calm settle over me that was deeper than anything I had felt in a long time. This was not anger. It was not grief. It was clarity. I stepped out of the car, closed the door behind me, and walked toward the entrance with steady, unhurried steps. Inside, the air was cool, the lighting soft, the receptionist offering a polite greeting as if this were any ordinary visit. And in a way, it was. I gave my name, waited only a moment, and then followed her down the hallway, each step quiet, deliberate, final in a way that did not need to be spoken aloud. When I reached the office and the door closed behind me, I took a seat and folded my hands in my lap, the same way I had the night before at the dinner table, the same way I had when I chose not to react. Only this time, there was no performance. No restraint. Only intention. I looked up, met the attorney's eyes, and allowed myself the smallest, most controlled smile. "I would like to make some changes," I said. I did not rush my words after I said them. I let them settle in the room the same way I had learned to let silence do its work, and the attorney, a man named Robert Keller who had known my family for years, leaned back slightly in his chair and studied me with a careful expression that suggested he already understood more than I had said aloud. "What kind of changes are you considering, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, his voice calm and professional, but there was a weight behind it, a recognition that this was not a routine update made out of convenience. I folded my hands more tightly in my lap. Not out of nerves, but to ground myself in the moment, to make sure that every word I chose would be deliberate and clear. "Everything," I replied quietly. He did not react immediately, but I saw the slight shift in his posture, the way he straightened just enough to signal that the conversation had moved beyond small adjustments. "I see," he said after a brief pause. "Then perhaps you can tell me what has changed." I looked past him for a moment, not at anything in particular, but at the reflection of my own thoughts, lining them up in a way that felt both unfamiliar and necessary. For years, I had approached decisions with consideration for others, weighing how each choice might affect the people around me, especially Michael. That instinct did not disappear overnight, but it had been replaced by something stronger, something that asked a different question entirely. Not what they needed, but what was right. "I want to ensure that what I have built is protected," I said finally, my voice steady. "And that it goes where it is valued, not assumed." Robert nodded slowly, as if he had expected something along those lines. "And currently your son is the primary beneficiary," he said, glancing briefly at the documents in front of him. "Yes," I answered, the words simple but heavy with the weight of years behind it. Years of trust, of belief, of a future I had once imagined differently. "And you would like to change that?" It was not a question. It was a confirmation. I met his gaze directly this time and gave a small, controlled nod. "Yes." The room felt quieter after that, as if even the air had adjusted to the shift. Robert reached for his pen, making a few notes, his movements measured, unhurried. "We can certainly do that," he said. "There are several options depending on how you would like your assets to be distributed. You may designate new beneficiaries, establish conditions, or create a trust if you prefer more oversight." I listened carefully, not because the terminology was unfamiliar, but because each option represented a different kind of statement. Not just about money or property, but about intention. About legacy. "Tell me about the conditions," I said. He looked up again, this time with a hint of curiosity. "Conditions allow you to set requirements that must be met before any inheritance is received," he explained. "They can be practical, financial, or even behavioral, though they must be legally enforceable." I considered that for a moment, the idea settling into place with a quiet precision. Conditions. Boundaries, written into something that could not be ignored or negotiated away in a moment of convenience. "And if those conditions are not met?" I asked. "Then the assets are redirected according to your instructions," he replied. I nodded once, slowly, as the shape of what I wanted began to take form. This was not about punishment. It was not about retaliation. It was about clarity. About ensuring that what mattered to me was recognized, even if it had not been before. "I would like to proceed with that," I said. Robert made another note, his pen moving smoothly across the paper. "Very well. We will need to go through each asset individually and determine how you would like it handled." We spent the next hour reviewing everything in detail: the house, the accounts, the investments I had managed carefully over the years. With each decision, I felt something settle more firmly within me, not a sense of loss, but of control. Of ownership, in a way that extended beyond legal definitions. At one point, Robert paused and looked at me with a more personal expression. "If I may ask," he said, his tone softer now, "is this something you have discussed with your family?" I allowed a faint smile to touch my lips, one that did not carry warmth so much as quiet certainty. "No," I answered. "It is not." He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded, understanding without pressing further. When we finished, he gathered the documents and placed them neatly in front of me. "We will prepare the revised will based on your instructions," he said. "Once it is ready, you will need to return to sign it in the presence of witnesses." I stood, smoothing my jacket with a small, habitual gesture that felt almost symbolic now. "Thank you," I said. As I walked out of the office, the hallway seemed a little brighter, the air a little lighter, though nothing around me had actually changed. The difference was internal, quiet but undeniable. By the time I reached my car, I realized something I had not expected. I was not thinking about Claire. I was not thinking about Michael. I was thinking about the future, not the one they had planned, but the one I was now shaping on my own terms. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. When I returned home that afternoon, nothing appeared different at first glance, and that was exactly what made everything feel so clear. The house stood the same way it always had, quiet, well kept, untouched by the decisions that had just been set into motion miles away. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, listening for a moment as the faint echo settled into silence. It was early enough that neither Claire nor Michael had returned yet, and for the first time in a long while, the house felt like it belonged to me again, not in ownership alone, but in presence. I set my keys down on the small table by the entryway and walked slowly through each room, not out of habit, but out of recognition. The living room still held the same furniture I had chosen years ago, each piece placed with intention, each detail reflecting a life that had once felt shared. The photographs on the shelves caught my attention again, and this time I stopped in front of them, taking a longer look than I had that morning. There was one of Michael at 8 years old, standing in the backyard with dirt on his hands and a grin that stretched across his entire face. I remembered that day clearly, how he had insisted on planting tomatoes even though he had no patience for waiting, how he had asked me every morning if they had grown overnight. I smiled faintly at the memory, not with warmth, but with a kind of distant understanding. He had not always been this man who avoided my eyes at the breakfast table. He had not always chosen silence. I moved to the next frame, one from a holiday years later, when Claire had just become part of our family. She stood beside Michael, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her smile bright and open, the kind that made it easy to trust her. I remembered welcoming her, offering her space, believing that she would add something to what we already had. And perhaps she had. Just not in the way I had expected. I turned away from the photographs and continued toward the kitchen, my steps slow but steady, each movement grounded in a clarity that no longer wavered. The sink was empty, the counters clean, everything in its place, just as Claire preferred it. Efficiency over sentiment. Order over history. I ran my hand lightly along the edge of the counter, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, and realized how many times I had stood here before, preparing meals, organizing schedules, making sure everything ran without interruption. It had never occurred to me then that one day I would be the interruption. That I would be the thing needing to be managed, adjusted, moved. The thought did not bring anger. It brought perspective. I poured myself another glass of water and sat down at the table, the same seat I had occupied that morning, and allowed the quiet to settle around me once more. There was a time when this silence would have felt heavy, filled with questions and doubt, but now it felt different. It felt like space. Space to think, to see, to decide without influence. I thought about the conversation in the attorney's office, about the way each decision had felt not like a loss, but like a correction. Something being set back into alignment after years of subtle shifts I had ignored. And then I thought about Claire again, not as a source of frustration or resentment, but as a catalyst. She had said what others might have only implied. She had drawn the line clearly enough for me to finally see it. In a strange way, that had been a gift. I heard the front door open a little after 5, followed by the familiar rhythm of footsteps entering the house. Claire's voice carried lightly from the hallway, speaking into her phone with the same composed tone she used for everything. Michael followed shortly after, his voice lower, distracted, already discussing something related to work. I remained seated at the table, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral, exactly as it had been the night before. When they entered the kitchen, Claire paused for a moment, her eyes flicking toward me with a brief look of acknowledgement. "You are back," she said, ending her call with a polite goodbye. I nodded slightly. "I am." Michael glanced at me, offering a quick smile that felt more habitual than intentional. "Everything okay?" he asked, already reaching for a glass from the cabinet. I met his gaze for just a moment, long enough to see the distance there, the quiet certainty that he no longer needed to check in beyond the surface. "Everything is fine," I replied. And for the first time, it was not a reassurance meant for them. It was a statement of fact meant for myself. Claire moved around the kitchen, gathering ingredients, preparing dinner with the same efficient movements, and I watched her for a moment without judgment, without resistance. She believed she understood the situation. She believed the outcome was already decided. And perhaps that was the most important part. I stood up slowly, taking my glass to the sink, and rinsed it carefully before placing it beside the others. No one questioned my movements. No one asked what I had done that day. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Because the less they noticed, the more certain they would be. And the more certain they were, the less prepared they would be for what was coming next. It was 3 days later when I finally heard it, not because they suddenly became careless, but because I had learned to listen differently, to pay attention to the pauses between their words instead of the words themselves. The house had settled into its usual evening rhythm, Claire moving through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, Michael in the living room with his laptop open, the soft glow of the screen reflecting off his face. I had gone upstairs earlier than usual, not out of fatigue, but out of intention, leaving them alone in a way that felt natural, expected. From the top of the staircase, I could hear their voices drifting upward, low and measured at first, the kind of conversation that was not meant to carry. I paused there, not hidden, not spying, simply standing still in a space where sound traveled more clearly than they realized. "We need to figure out the timing," Claire said, her tone calm but precise. "We cannot wait too long." There was a brief silence, followed by the faint sound of Michael closing his laptop. "I know," he replied, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "I just do not want it to look rushed." Rushed. The word lingered in the air, settling into place with a clarity that required no interpretation. I remained where I was, my hand resting lightly against the banister, my breathing even, controlled. "It will not," Claire said. "If we present it the right way, it will seem like we are helping her. Like it is her idea." I closed my eyes for a moment, not in pain, not in disbelief, but in recognition. There it was. Not concern. Not suggestion. Strategy. "She already seems open to it," Claire continued. "After dinner the other night she did not argue at all. That makes this easier." Easier. I opened my eyes again, my gaze fixed on the space in front of me, though I was no longer seeing the hallway or the walls or the framed photographs that lined them. I was seeing the pattern, the full shape of something that had been forming quietly for longer than I had allowed myself to admit. "What about the house?" Michael asked after a moment, his voice carrying a hint of hesitation. "We cannot do anything until everything is transferred." Claire's response came without delay. "That is why we need to move forward with the plan. Once she agrees to relocate, everything else becomes much simpler. Relocate. Such a gentle word, just like downsizing. Just like easier. Words designed to soften the edges of something far more deliberate. I shifted my weight slightly, careful not to make a sound, though I knew now that I did not need to hide. They were not looking for me. They were not considering the possibility that I might already understand. And if she changes her mind? Michael asked. There was a pause then, longer this time, and when Claire spoke again, her tone had changed just enough to reveal what lay beneath the surface. She will not, she said. She does not have anywhere else to go. The certainty in her voice was absolute. Unshaken, built on an assumption so complete that it left no room for doubt. I felt something settle inside me at that moment, not a reaction, not an emotion, but a final piece clicking into place. This was not about timing. It was not about convenience. It was about control. About ensuring that every outcome aligned with their expectations, their plans, their version of what my life should look like. I turned slowly and made my way back to my room, each step quiet, deliberate, the same way I had moved through the attorney's office, the same way I had moved through the house earlier that day. Nothing in my expression changed. Nothing in my posture shifted. But inside, everything had already been decided. Later that night, at dinner, the conversation was light, almost pleasant, as if the discussion downstairs had never happened. Claire spoke about a new project, Michael nodded along, adding small comments, and I listened without interruption, my presence as unobtrusive as they had come to expect. At one point, Claire looked at me and smiled, that same composed, reassuring smile she used when she wanted something to feel harmless. We were thinking, she said, her voice gentle, that it might be nice to explore some options for you. Somewhere with less upkeep, more community. It could really be a positive change. I met her gaze calmly, holding it just long enough to acknowledge the performance without exposing it. That sounds thoughtful, I replied. Michael glanced at me then, perhaps searching for resistance, for hesitation, for anything that might complicate the plan they had already set in motion. But there was nothing there for him to find. I picked up my fork, continued eating, and allowed the moment to pass exactly as they expected it would. And that was when I understood something even more important than what I had overheard. They believed the outcome was already decided. They believed I was already moving in the direction they had chosen for me. And because of that, they would not look any closer. They would not question the quiet. They would not see the shift that had already taken place. And that, more than anything else, was what made what came next not just possible, but inevitable. The next morning, I woke with the same steady calm that had followed me since the moment I stood at the top of the staircase and heard the truth spoken plainly, not in anger, not in cruelty, but in certainty, which somehow made it more revealing than anything else. I did not replay their words in my mind, not in the way someone might dwell on a wound, but in the way one studies a blueprint, carefully, deliberately, understanding how each piece fits into the larger design. Claire had said I had nowhere else to go, and in her world, that was true, because she had already defined the boundaries of what my life was supposed to be. But what she did not understand was that those boundaries had never been hers to draw. I moved through my morning routine as usual, preparing coffee, setting the table, maintaining the rhythm they had come to expect from me, and when Claire entered the kitchen, she greeted me with that same composed politeness, as if nothing had shifted, as if the conversation from the night before had never taken place. "Good morning," she said lightly, reaching for a mug. I nodded in return. "Good morning." Michael followed shortly after, his presence filling the space without truly engaging with it, his attention already divided between his phone and whatever responsibilities waited for him outside this house. "I have a meeting early today," he said, almost as an explanation, though I had not asked. "I will be out most of the afternoon." I acknowledged him with a small nod, my expression neutral, my tone even. "Of course." Claire glanced at him, then back at me, her eyes lingering just a moment longer than necessary, as if she were assessing something, measuring my reaction against her expectations. But there was nothing for her to read. I gave her nothing to interpret, nothing to question. That was the advantage now. The less I revealed, the more confident they became in their assumptions. After they left, the house settled into silence once again, and I allowed myself a moment to stand in the center of the living room, looking around not with nostalgia, but with clarity. This place, these walls, everything within them, had been built over time, shaped by decisions I had made, sacrifices I had accepted, and a vision I had once believed was shared. Now, it was simply an asset in someone else's plan. I walked to the desk in the corner of the room, the one I had used for years to keep track of bills, documents, and the quiet responsibilities that had held everything together, and I opened the drawer where I kept my records. Everything was there, neatly organized, labeled in a way that made sense only to me. Statements, deeds, account numbers, all the details that Claire and Michael assumed they understood, but had never truly examined. I took out a small folder and placed it on the desk, opening it slowly, reviewing its contents with a careful eye. Not because I needed to confirm anything, but because I wanted to see it again, to remind myself of the reality behind their assumptions. Ownership. Control. Authority. Words that had never needed to be spoken before, because they had always been understood. I closed the folder and returned it to its place, then reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. I hesitated for only a second, not out of doubt, but out of recognition that this was another step forward, another quiet decision that would shape what came next. Then I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. "Good morning, this is Eleanor Hayes," I said when the line connected. "I would like to confirm my appointment to finalize the documents." The voice on the other end responded promptly, professionally, confirming the time, the details, the requirements. I listened carefully, making note of everything, though I already knew what needed to be done. "I will be there," I said simply before ending the call. The rest of the day passed in a way that would have seemed ordinary to anyone watching from the outside. I tidied the house, prepared a simple meal, maintained the routine that had become expected of me, but beneath each action, there was intention, a quiet awareness that nothing I did now was accidental. Every movement, every word, every silence was part of something larger, something that did not need to be revealed yet. When Claire and Michael returned that evening, the atmosphere was the same as it had been the night before, calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. Claire spoke about her day, Michael responded in kind, and I listened, offering small acknowledgments when appropriate, never disrupting the flow they had created. At one point, Claire turned to me, her expression soft, her tone carefully measured. "I have been looking into a few places," she said, "just to get an idea of what is available. Some of them are really quite lovely." I met her gaze briefly, allowing a faint smile to form, one that carried no resistance, no challenge. "That sounds nice," I replied. She seemed satisfied with that, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, as if each small agreement confirmed that everything was proceeding exactly as she had planned. And perhaps, in her mind, it was. But what she could not see, what neither of them could see, was that the plan had already shifted, not in a way that disrupted their expectations immediately, but in a way that would redefine the outcome entirely. I finished my dinner, set my plate in the sink, and excused myself with the same quiet composure I had maintained from the beginning. Upstairs, in the privacy of my room, I sat down at the edge of the bed and allowed myself a single, steady breath, not to calm myself, but to acknowledge the moment. Everything was in motion now. The pieces were aligned. And for the first time, I was not reacting to what they were doing. I was deciding what would happen next. The appointment was set for Thursday morning, and I did not mention it to either of them, not because I needed to hide it in the traditional sense, but because it no longer belonged in their version of my life. The days leading up to it unfolded with a quiet precision, each moment layered with the same calm awareness that had settled into me since the night on the staircase. I moved through the house as I always had, preparing meals, keeping things in order, responding when spoken to, but there was a distance now, not visible on the surface, but present in everything I did. Claire continued her subtle campaign, weaving suggestions into casual conversations, presenting options that sounded thoughtful, reasonable, even generous if one did not listen closely enough. There is a community about 15 miles from here, she mentioned one afternoon, standing at the counter with her tablet in hand. They have beautiful walking paths, activities, even transportation services. It might be something worth considering. I nodded as I dried a glass, my movements slow, unhurried. That sounds very convenient, I said. She watched me for a moment, perhaps expecting more, perhaps waiting for a question or hesitation, but when none came, she returned her attention to the screen, satisfied that the idea had been planted. Michael was less direct, but no less involved. He began asking small questions, ones that seemed practical on the surface, but carried a different intention underneath. Have you thought about what you would want if you did move? He asked one evening, leaning against the doorway as I arranged dishes in the cabinet. I paused just long enough to acknowledge the question without giving it weight. I have not made any decisions, I replied. He nodded, as if that answer aligned perfectly with what he needed to hear. Well, we just want to make sure you are comfortable, he said. Comfortable. Another carefully chosen word, another layer of reassurance built on an outcome they had already decided. I allowed the conversation to end there, not because I had nothing to say, but because saying less had become more powerful than anything else I could offer. On Wednesday evening, the night before my appointment, Claire brought up the topic again at dinner, her tone softer, more persuasive. We could even visit a few places this weekend, she suggested, just to see what feels right. There is no pressure, of course. I looked at her then, meeting her eyes with a calm that revealed nothing, and offered a small, polite smile. That might be nice, I said. She seemed pleased with that, her expression easing as if each agreement confirmed that everything was unfolding according to her expectations. Michael glanced between us, his posture relaxing, his shoulders lowering slightly as the tension he did not acknowledge began to fade. They believed I was moving toward their conclusion, step by step, without resistance, without question. And I let them believe it. That night, after the house had gone quiet, I prepared for the next morning with the same deliberate care I had given to every decision leading up to it. I chose my clothes carefully, not out of vanity, but out of respect for the moment, something simple, understated, but composed. I placed my documents in my bag, reviewing them once more, not because I doubted what I had done, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it, the finality, the certainty. I slept well, not deeply, but peacefully, without the restless thoughts that had once filled my nights. When morning came, I followed my routine as usual, making coffee, setting the table, maintaining the pattern that had become so familiar and no longer required thought. Claire entered the kitchen first, offering a brief smile, her attention already divided. Good morning, she said. I returned the greeting with the same calm neutrality. Michael joined shortly after, his movements efficient, his focus already on the day ahead. I might be late tonight, he mentioned, adjusting his watch. We have a meeting that could run over. I nodded slightly. That is fine. There was no curiosity in their eyes, no question about my plans, no consideration that I might have something of my own to attend to. And that was exactly how I wanted it. After they left, I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and set it carefully in the rack, taking a moment to look around the kitchen one more time. Everything was in its place, everything as it had been, and yet nothing felt the same. I picked up my bag, checked that everything I needed was inside, and walked to the door with steady, unhurried steps. As I stepped outside, the air felt cool, clear, the kind of morning that carries a quiet sense of possibility without needing to announce it. I closed the door behind me, locked it with a simple turn of the key, and walked to my car without looking back. Because there was nothing left in that moment that required hesitation. Everything that mattered was already in motion. The office felt the same as it had just days before, quiet, controlled, untouched by the decisions that carried so much weight within its walls, and as I stepped inside, I noticed how easily I moved now, without hesitation, without the subtle uncertainty that had once accompanied moments like this. Robert Keller greeted me with a polite nod, his expression professional but attentive, as if he understood that what we were about to finalize was not simply paperwork, but something far more deliberate. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "Everything is ready." I took my seat slowly, placing my bag beside me, my movements measured, composed, and entirely certain. He placed the documents in front of me, neatly arranged, each page representing a decision I had already made, a direction I had already chosen. "I have incorporated all of your instructions," he continued. "The revised will reflect the changes we discussed, including the redistribution of your assets and the conditions attached to certain allocations." I nodded once, my eyes moving over the first page, not because I needed to read every word again, but because I wanted to see it as it now existed, complete and unchangeable once signed. The language was precise, formal, structured in a way that left no room for interpretation. Ownership remained exactly where it had always been, but the outcome, the future tied to it, had shifted entirely. Michael's name was no longer positioned as the inevitable recipient of everything I had built. Instead, it was placed within a framework that required more than assumption, more than proximity, more than silence. Conditions had been set, not harsh, not unreasonable, but clear, defined in a way that could not be ignored or bypassed. And beyond that, there were other allocations, thoughtful, intentional, directed toward places and people who would recognize their value rather than expect it. "Do you have any questions before we proceed?" Robert asked, his tone steady. I looked up from the document and met his gaze, my expression calm, unwavering. "No," I said simply. He inclined his head slightly and reached for a pen, placing it gently on the paper in front of me. "Then whenever you are ready." For a brief moment, I allowed myself to pause, not out of doubt, but out of acknowledgement. This was the moment where intention became action, where thought became something fixed and real. I thought about the dinner table, about Claire's voice as she spoke with quiet certainty, about Michael's silence, about the assumption that everything was already decided. And then I let that thought go, because it no longer mattered. I picked up the pen and signed my name, my hand steady, my signature clear and deliberate, each letter forming exactly as it had for years, unchanged, even as everything else had shifted around it. Robert guided me through the remaining pages, indicating where to initial, where to sign again, his movements efficient, respectful of the moment without drawing attention to it. When it was finished, he gathered the documents and reviewed them briefly, ensuring everything was in order before placing them into a folder. "It is done," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a finality that settled into the room with quiet certainty. I exhaled slowly, not as a release of tension, but as a recognition of completion. "Thank you," I replied. He nodded, then added, "These documents will be secured, and copies can be provided upon request. If there are any further changes in the future, we can always revisit them." I allowed a faint smile to touch my lips, one that reflected understanding more than anything else. "I believe this will be sufficient," I said. I stood, smoothing my jacket once more, the gesture familiar now, almost symbolic of the composure I had maintained throughout all of this. As I walked toward the door, I did not feel lighter, nor heavier, but steadier, as if something that had been unsettled for a long time had finally been placed exactly where it belonged. Outside, the day continued as it always did, cars passing, people moving through their routines, unaware of the quiet shift that had just taken place within a small office on an ordinary street. I walked to my car, opened the door, and paused for a moment before getting in, my hand resting lightly on the frame. Claire believed she understood the direction of my life. Michael believed the future was already his. They both believed that time was on their side, that patience would eventually deliver everything they expected without resistance. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, the sound firm but not abrupt, final but not dramatic. As I started the engine, I allowed myself one small, controlled thought, not spoken aloud, not shared, but fully formed. They would continue exactly as they had been, confident, certain, unaware. And I would let them. Because now, more than ever, I understood that the most powerful changes are the ones no one sees coming, the ones that unfold quietly, without announcement, until the moment they can no longer be ignored. When I returned home that afternoon, nothing in the house suggested that anything had changed, and that was exactly what made the moment feel so complete. The same quiet greeted me as I stepped inside, the same carefully arranged furniture, the same soft light filtering through the windows, the same sense of order that Claire maintained with such precision. I set my keys down in their usual place and walked into the kitchen, noticing how easily I slipped back into the rhythm they expected, how naturally I resumed the role they believed I still occupied. Claire was already there, preparing dinner, her movements efficient, controlled, her expression calm in a way that suggested everything was proceeding exactly as she had planned. She glanced up when she heard me enter and offered a small smile. "You are back," she said. I nodded, returning the gesture with the same quiet composure. "I am." Michael arrived shortly after, loosening his tie as he stepped into the room, his attention divided between the conversation and the device in his hand. "Traffic was terrible," he said, placing his phone on the counter. "Took me almost an hour to get across town." Claire responded with a sympathetic nod, then turned her attention back to the stove, continuing as if the day had unfolded without interruption. I watched them both for a moment, not with resentment, not with anger, but with a kind of clarity that made everything feel distant and defined. At the same time, they moved through the space as if it already belonged to them, as if my presence were temporary, transitional, something that would soon resolve itself into the future they had already imagined. And for the first time, I allowed myself to see that assumption not as something to challenge, but as something to use. Dinner passed in the same quiet, controlled manner it always did, conversation light, predictable, carefully balanced. Claire spoke about a new development she had found, describing it with just enough enthusiasm to make it sound appealing without seeming insistent. "It is about 20 minutes away," she said, placing a dish on the table. "Very peaceful, very well maintained. I think you would like it." I took a small bite of my food, letting the moment stretch just long enough to acknowledge her effort without giving it weight. "It sounds lovely," I replied. Michael glanced at me, his expression softening slightly, as if reassured by my response. "We could go this weekend," he added. "Just to take a look." I met his gaze briefly, offering a faint, agreeable smile. "We will see," I said. The answer was neither a commitment nor a refusal, but it was enough. It always had been. They did not press further. They did not need to. In their minds, everything was already moving in the direction they expected. After dinner, I cleared my plate and moved to the sink, rinsing it carefully before placing it with the others, my movements steady, unremarkable. Claire thanked me lightly, as she always did, and I acknowledged her with a small nod before stepping away. No one asked where I had been that morning. No one asked what I had done. And that absence of curiosity, that complete confidence in their understanding of my life, settled into me with quiet certainty. Later that evening, I sat in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light over the space, and listened as their voices carried faintly from the kitchen, discussing plans, timelines, small details that fit neatly into the future they had already constructed. I did not need to hear every word. I already knew the shape of it. I leaned back slightly in my chair, folding my hands in my lap, the same way I had done at the attorney's office, the same way I had done at the dinner table, and allowed myself a moment of stillness that felt entirely my own. There was no urgency now. No need to react, no need to reveal, no need to correct anything they believed. The truth did not require immediate recognition to exist. It simply needed time. And time, I realized, was no longer something they controlled. When I finally stood to go upstairs, I paused briefly at the base of the staircase, listening as Claire laughed softly at something Michael had said, the sound light, confident, certain. They believed they had already won. They believed the outcome was inevitable. I turned without making a sound and walked up the stairs, each step quiet, deliberate, leading me back to a space that was still mine, at least for now. Inside my room, I closed the door gently and sat at the edge of the bed, my hands resting loosely in my lap, my posture relaxed, my mind clear. I did not think about confrontation. I did not think about explanations. I thought only about the moment that would come, not with noise or conflict, but with the simple, undeniable weight of truth. Because everything had already been set in motion, every decision made, every document signed, every detail secured in a way that did not require their awareness to be effective. I lay back against the pillows, staring up at the ceiling, and allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form. Not out of satisfaction, not out of triumph, but out of understanding. They had planned everything carefully. They had considered every step. They had accounted for every possibility they could see. But they had made one mistake, quiet, simple, and absolute. They had assumed I would remain exactly where they had placed me. And that assumption would be the one thing they could not undo.